sweatshop flavor. I organized my local community in a boycott against the Gap, the largest offender at the time. As a result of this effort, I became the subject of ridicule among my friends at school. The one community I was a part of that embraced progressive values was my Jewish community. I attended a Jewish summer camp where I learned about Israel through hummus and Zionist thinkers, as well as through housing demolitions and settler violence. I was taught that as a Jew, I am responsible for helping to create a Jewish homeland that lives by the progressive values of justice, democracy, and equality. I was thrilled to begin my undergraduate career at Tufts University, a breath of fresh air after growing up in conservative suburbia. Finally, my passion for progressive causes would be the norm, not the oddball exception. Shortly after arriving at Tufts, I realized that my perspective on Israel, imparted to me by my progressive Israel education, was not the norm for the students engaging in the issue. I began to witness the vitriolic back and forths of the pro-Israel and pro-Palestinian groups on my campus. I felt demonized by the pro-Palestinian group because of my commitment to Israel, and I felt unfulfilled by the pro-Israel group because of my commitment to speaking up against injustice. Tensions between these two groups peaked this past spring during the first Israeli apartheid week at Tufts. I became frustrated hearing the two dominant voices on the conflict fall back on the same sound bites, painting the conflict as a black and white issue with a clear right and wrong. I decided I had to express myself on this issue and wrote my first ever op-ed for the school paper, calling for events that are nuanced, not inflammatory. I was overwhelmed by the responses I received from other Jewish students who, like me, are looking for a different way to support Israel, a form of activism that supports their commitment to justice, equality, and self-determination for Jews and Palestinians. I'm now working with many like-minded Tufts students to create a J Street U on our campus and run the types of events and discussions that have been missing from our campus discourse. J Street U is the student-led organizing arm of J Street, committed to encouraging political leaders to pursue a two-state solution, creating a home for students who want to bring together their commitment to Israel with commitment to values of justice and democracy, and to changing the conversation about Israel and the Middle East. As you engage with the speakers this evening, consider what this means to you and how you put your progressive values into action. Now Chris will be introducing our speakers.
I am pleased to introduce our two speakers for this evening. Mr. Matthew Duss is a policy analyst and director of Middle East Progress at the Center for American Progress. Mr. Duss received a master's degree in Middle East Studies from the University of Washington's Jackson School of International Studies and a BA in Political Science from the University of Washington. His writing has appeared in the LA Times, the Boston Globe, the Baltimore Sun, The Nation, and others. He has appeared as a commentator on CNN, Fox News, and Al Jazeera, as well as other TV programs and numerous radio programs. Mr. Daniel Kalik is Director of Political Affairs at J Street, where he manages J Street PAC, the largest pro-Israel PAC in the United States. His political career began at an early age as he grew up in the first-in-the-nation primary state of New Hampshire. There, he was lucky enough to meet every presidential candidate who ran for office in the 80s and 90s. Later, he worked in Vermont at the national headquarters of Howard Dean's campaign in the 2004 election cycle. He holds a law degree from the George Washington University, is a member of the Massachusetts Bar, and holds an economics degree from Tufts University. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris, for introducing the speakers, and thank you, Matt and Dan, for being with us today. I'm going to moderate a short discussion here, and then we're going to open it up for questions from anyone who would like to ask something. So the topic of today's discussion is, can pro-Israel be progressive? But I think both of your presences here show already that it's possible. So I'd like to ask you about your background and your profession, and how progressivism and pro-Israel have played into those. You can start. Sure.
Well, thank you guys for having us today. Thanks for the nice intro. Glad to see a lot of Tufts University being represented. And I see I have a fellow GW law student in the or maybe you're JPAC undergrad. That's okay. I'll take either. So yeah, I mean, I guess we said we grew up in New Hampshire, grew up with politics all around me. I don't think I realized until I went to Tufts that it was weird that I had met every single presidential candidate, whether it was Bill Clinton at the mall outside of McDonald's, or Paul Tsongas reading to my elementary school class, or Lamar Alexander walking with his plaid shirt up and down my street. I thought that was normal. I thought that happened in every state. I guess it did not. So, you know, I grew up with politics all around me. As far as the Jewish community of New Hampshire, besides my mom and myself, I think there are, you know, probably another 5,000 or so. It's a really small, tight-knit Jewish community. So when these presidential, you know, hopefuls would come through the state and speak to, you know, at the one JCC or one of the two or three synagogues that exist in the state, you know, we would sit there for 20 to 30 minutes about how Iran was acquiring a nuclear weapon and how they loved to eat hummus every single day. And, you know, I looked around the room and I saw a group of, you know, very progressive, you know, people that cared about the environment, people that cared about healthcare, you know, your basic progressive community that Jewish Americans are all across the country. And I wondered what their obsession was in talking about the Israel politics in this extremely hawkish way, and it just didn't seem to connect with where I was coming from or where my community was coming from. So, you know, later you said I worked for Howard Dean's presidential campaign. You know, he had an interesting relationship with this issue. He had a small house party where he decided to say an offhanded remark, which was his specialty, that the U.S. should be even-handed in dealing with Israelis and Palestinians. Doesn't seem that controversial in my mind, but this led off about 4 months of email forwards from various people, including my Jewish grandfather in Miami, that said, "Why are you working for this anti-Semitic, anti-Israel candidate?" Which is strange because I had just come from an event from his wife, Judy Steinberg, and his Jewish children were there, and I didn't really think that he hated me, his wife, or his children at the event. So I knew there was something that was wrong with the politics surrounding Israel in the way that a disconnect between the progressivism that you see that's very strong in American Jews. It's one of the most progressive, you know, ethnic or religious groups that exist in America, and where the politicians were talking about and how they were expressing their so-called pro-Israel views. So I think, you know, a lot of us who are here, who are, you know, consider ourselves progressives, you know, the question really, you know, this is called, can pro-Israel be progressive? It's more, how can progressives be pro-Israel? And I think that it's a more interesting question to look at as someone who has these progressive values, no matter how you define that, which is another conversation. How can you express support for what you believe on all issues? And when it comes to Israel, you know, you don't need to, you know, walk away from this one issue, because there's actually a lot of ways that you can be very much in line with your values and supporting Israel without going kind of down the road that we see a lot of politicians go. So I'll stop there and turn over that.
Thank you, and it's a real pleasure to speak to you today. It's always great to see people engaged politically, and always great to do things with J Street, of whom I'm a big fan. So just a little bit on my background. I grew up in the conservative evangelical church, where, you know, Christian Zionism was part of the air we breathed. It was just understood that, you know, the creation of the modern state of Israel was fulfillment of biblical prophecy, and, you know, it wasn't kind of a specific sort of, you know, red heifer sort of Christian Zionism like John Hagee. It was just kind of a nominal understanding that this is the way that history will progress under God's guiding hand, and we really shouldn't question it. So, you know, as I got older, as many people do, I started to question my faith more, and I started to kind of look into this issue a little bit more, and it became clear that it was a bit more complicated than, you know, just prophecy moving along down a preset track. But even as I moved away from organized religion, or especially the conservative evangelical church, I still, you know, my beliefs are, even to this day, still very much grounded in the Christian ethic, which I think, you know, it flows very well with the progressive ethic. I mean, I see the basic ethic of progressivism as being, we're all in this together, and you can find roots of that in Judaism, in Christianity, and I think in all the major faiths and ethical traditions. So looking at the question of progressive and pro-Israel, I think it's just worth looking at those two things separately first. What does it mean to be progressive? How's progressivism different than liberalism? I think liberalism is traditionally concerned with individual rights primarily. I think progressivism takes that, but also adds, we need to understand that an individual's rights and responsibilities embedded, or in relationship to a community. So it takes, not necessarily puts the benefit of the community over the individual, but needs to understand that an individual is not by him or herself. An individual exists in a community, and we should work to strengthen the community and create a more equitable and fair and just society for all of us, for each individual, where there's a level playing field and privileged interests don't have the ability to tilt the playing field in their direction. In terms of foreign policy, which is the area where I work, progressivism involves a commitment to strengthening an international rules-based order where might does not necessarily make right, and an understanding that the United States is stronger when we work within that international system, that there's a belief in this idea of legitimacy, which those of you who study political science have or probably will come across at some point. Seymour Martin Lipset, the famous political scientist, defined legitimacy as the belief that the ability of a system to maintain the belief that its procedures and institutions are the most appropriate ones for a society. I think that's almost verbatim. Okay, professors are here right now. And so when the United States is seen as working within a legitimate order, acting legitimately within an international consensus, we are stronger. I think the writer Josh Marshall talked about the U.S. engagement in the UN and other multilateral organizations, and used a sentence that I've probably referred to many, many times: legitimacy is the ultimate force multiplier. I really, really like that. I think that expresses the way that I, as a progressive, view foreign policy. If we could look at Iraq and the disaster that was Iraq and still is in many ways, we had no legitimacy going in. We were seen as an illegitimate presence there. We were seen as an illegitimate presence not only by the people of Iraq, but by many around the world. And I think that is one of the things, without being too political here, one of the things that I do appreciate about the Obama administration, even though I have many criticisms, is that they have worked, I think, to re-engage with the international system, with various multilateral organizations, in order to, that the United States be seen as acting legitimately. Or with an aura of legitimacy. Now, getting to pro-Israel, I see being pro-Israel as a very, very simple art. I support the right of Israel to exist as a secure Jewish and democratic state. I think there's a lot of people who would like to define pro-Israel as being just uncritically supportive of whatever the Israeli government wants to do at any given time, but I just don't see any progressive as being able to do that for any government. It's simply, in my view, not progressive to simply say, okay, well, the government, that's the government, they're a democracy, they get to do whatever they want, I can't criticize. No, I'm going to criticize my own government, I will criticize the democratic government of Turkey, I will criticize the democratic government of Israel when I think it's acting in ways that are inhumane or what have you. So yeah, I see that as a fairly simple question. Now, having made that simple statement, obviously there is a range of, people will disagree over what's inappropriate, what's inhumane, whether certain actions are justified, and that's all fine. Let's have that discussion. But anyway, that's it.
Okay, thank you guys. I have a different follow-up question for each of you two. First, for Dan, you asked a great question. I want you to answer it yourself, which was, how can a progressive be pro-Israel? A better question than, can progressive be pro-Israel? But if I am a progressive and I want to stay true to these values, what specifically would it look like for me to be pro-Israel? So can you talk about that for a while?
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to first touch on kind of the definition of pro-Israel.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that what has happened over the course of Israel's history, which is not that long, particularly in this country, unfortunately, the definition that I completely agree with Matt on of what it means to be pro-Israel or pro-American or pro-Turkey or pro-any country there's often a struggle between kind of the nationalistic tendencies of any culture and those who want to criticize when they disagree with the government. So I completely agree with that. I think particularly in pro-Israel, the band of acceptability has become very narrowed in our discourse. So I think it's become very difficult for people to see the words pro-Israel and think of anything but I support exact policies. Mitt Romney said there's no daylight. Under Obama there was daylight. Under me there's no daylight. Because I'm so pro-Israel, there can be no daylight between me and the Israeli government. Well, the Israeli government, it's a coalition government that changes hands every 25 months. So for you to have no daylight, it becomes difficult to stay infallible on your pro-Israel credentials there. So I just think that it's important, and I think groups like J Street and the writing Matt does, to give a broader definition to pro-Israel. And once you have that broader definition, I think that there's nothing stopping a progressive who believes in that we're all in this together, believes in institutions, UN, international law, to say, oh yeah, I support Israel's right to exist. I support the Palestinians' right to exist and to have their own country. And I can be both pro-Israel and pro-Palestinian and pro-Palestine. And there's no conflict in that. So I think what happens to progressives a lot is they see what the discourse is on this issue, and it's a third rail. They don't want to discuss it, and so they decide, I'm going to go focus on other progressive issues that I can deal with. When really, particularly in the Jewish American community, where you have cousins that are in Israel, or you visit there often, or you have a connection to this place, it's really an injustice, I think, to say I'm not going to deal with an issue that affects you and your family and friends and cousins, and you really need to speak out for what's going to secure its future. So I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah.
We'll move on to that anyways.
Okay, sure. Matt, you mentioned this idea that it's very important to you for the United States to work within a global community to promote legitimacy. I'd like to ask, how does U.S. engagement on this specific issue work in that larger frame?
Well, there's two ways to go about this. We talk about the U.S.-Israel relationship as one of values, which I think is quite true, both at the democracy level. And that's something I believe in. I think the United States should support other democracies, just full stop, whether Israel or not. Supporting democracy, I think, is an important element of progressive and foreign policy. There's also, just as a matter of sort of cultural, social fact, when people talk about the special relationship, that's kind of what I was raised in. It's not just, obviously Jewish Americans have a special, relationship with Israel, but I think there's a broader sort of cultural identification. When people talk about Judeo-Christian, even though it's a relatively recent term, that's a real thing. That is an identification, that's a history we share, a social, religious, a common understanding of ethics that I think, has to be respected. In terms of how all this plays within an international rules-based order, the UN is is very tough in managing this. I think the general view is that the U.S. has a lot of interests, and often working with some of these other partners is made tougher because of their views on Israel. So it's finding a middle ground and saying, okay, a lot of this criticism is not justified, and a lot of it's not. And I think that's just very clear. If you look at the amount of time that bodies at the UN spend criticizing Israel, it's very hard to defend that when you look at the broad sweep of crises around the world and the way that people are treated around the world. But still recognizing that, A, it's in the U.S. interest that this conflict, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the Israeli-Arab conflict, be resolved, fairly, if not completely justly. Pragmatism is a big part of progressivism as well, and saying, listen, no one's going to get everything that they want, but there is a way to solve this. And recognizing that it's in both these people's interests, Israelis and Palestinians, to do that. I think there's a lot of, there's the strength of the international consensus on this question is quite formidable in favor of a two-state solution. So I guess we can get, later in the conversation, we can get to some of the reasons why the U.S. has not been able to implement that consensus. But when it comes to, working within an international rules-based order, it's interesting how strong the impetus is toward this solution.
So Dan, I want to ask you, Matt touched on it a little bit, but to be a progressive American who supports Israel, what would that look like? What types of policies do you think that progressive American would support?
For me, I think the only way, let me not do what the other side does. I think the best way to be pro-Israel is to understand that Israel's future as a Jewish democratic state depends on the creation of a Palestinian state living next to it. It's the only way, due to demographics, it's the only way to have borders that are recognized by your neighbors, that you want to live with peace in, that you want to trade with. So anyone who doesn't understand that that's the only way for Israel to survive in the Israel that we know it to survive, and there's an urgency to get that done. I think that's the truest, best way to be a friend to Israel. It's easy for me to say that because I'm not worried about, there's a lot of domestic politics, whether you're the Palestinian leadership, the Israeli leadership, and the U.S. leadership, that prevents people from, pushing that forward. But I think that that's completely in line with values of justice, democracy, rule of law, international cooperation, respecting human rights, all of which I consider progressive values, and being the most pro-Israel you can be.
Matt, why do you think it's been so hard for the United States to have a more progressive approach to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
One, the leadership in the two countries, I think, either, on the Israeli side right now, I think it's a coalition that is not genuinely friendly to a Palestinian state. And you've got a situation in which, I think to understand where the Israeli public is right now, I think you simply need to understand the impact that the Second Intifada had. There's really no getting around that. It was a devastating number of years there. That's all you probably understand. So it's very politically difficult to get an Israeli leadership that is willing to start pulling back out of the territories and take the chance that that sort of thing can start up again. On the Palestinian side, you have a leadership that is seen as having failed to deliver year after year after year. And people are really losing hope, and they've become more and more open to other solutions. I don't think you've got anywhere near a critical mass of one-staters among the young Palestinians, but it is growing. And the kind of the resignation that I sense when I'm over there amongst Palestinians is very, very striking, even amongst people who work for the government, even amongst people who are training to serve that state ostensibly, since we don't see it as possible. And then, we have to acknowledge the domestic politics here in the United States. It's not just, powerful lobbies like AIPAC. It's also, the Christian Zionist lobby. Kufi has 1 million members now. That's pretty amazing. And it does, it constrains the president, I think, from taking certain steps to implement what I think, as I said earlier, is a pretty strong international consensus. We saw this on the struggle over the settlements. This is not a new request. This was the president trying to get Israel to honor obligations it had already committed to under the roadmap, in addition to being just something that's in international law, a violation of international law. But we saw how difficult it was for the president and his administration to sustain pressure on that issue. Now, I guess we certainly disagree over whether that was the best thing to do, whether settlements were the right argument to make. But still, for something that's as cut and dried as a kind of international legal question, it was very striking to see how difficult it was for him to kind of implement that.
I think, in my own experience talking to young progressives in the United States, there's a challenge for Israel, being pro-Israel, to be seen as a progressive cause. And I think with young people, it's for a particular reason. I have a quote to read that I'd like you guys to comment on. The vast majority of Republicans, for a range of reasons, are viscerally pro-Israel. To put it this way, it's easier to be pro-choice than anti-Israel in the GOP. It was in the Washington Post. If you're a young progressive, you don't want to take on a cause that is further and further associated with the right. Do you see this as a problem? Do you think it's part of the reason why we don't seem to have a more moderate conversation about the topic? Either one of you can comment.
I'll go. So yeah, I mean, I think that, I see what you're saying. I mean, I think that no one is close to anti-Israel in the U.S. Congress, which is what they're talking about. If you take the furthest left, if this is a left-right issue, person on this issue, and the furthest right person on this issue, they're still pro-Israel. They support, there's no one out there, maybe Kucinich occasionally says a comment on the floor, who isn't constantly voting for continued aid to Israel, continued support militarily. There just really isn't any sort of anti-Israel faction that has any traction in the U.S. politic. And I think this comes, back to the point where it's really not people arguing about if they're supportive of Israel, but if they're supportive in this, cookie-cutter, hawkish way that, is much more identified with, traditional Republican views on foreign policy and the use of American force. And I just think that as far as young progressives, I think it's, if you look at what it means to be pro-Israel and say that that's not pro-Israel, there's other ways that you can do it. I think that opens it up, to more participation on this. So, I think I'll leave it at that unless you want to add.
Sure, no, but I think the challenge that you're talking about is, for progressives, especially on foreign policy, is bigger than just this issue. It's, conservatives tend to have a view of the world that's fairly cut and dry. There's evil people out there that are trying to kill you, and we need to go kill them first. And when you're dealing in a political, context where, short, sharp messages do the job, progressives' response is always, it's kind of more complicated than that, and here's why. And that, as a political messaging, it's not the most appealing, but that's, if we want to have an educated, good, healthy conversation about that, we have to find ways of making these more complex arguments and winning them. So again, look, you could say it's we're pro-America, we want to invade Iraq. Oh really? You benefited Iran and you bankrupted this country and you unleashed a plague of terrorism across the region. That's not pro-American, but yet, that's the sense of being willing to go out and blow things up.
It's a longer bumper sticker.
Right, exactly. I'm working on that. I'm trying to get it down. The same with Israel, just this sense if you take Israel's side against all these, horrible people surrounding them and always support what they do, and, it's not the most satisfying rejoinder to say, well, it's more complex, but, that's what we have to learn how to do, to kind of not necessarily dumb down our arguments, but find ways to make these somewhat more complex points in an appealing way.
And even with that challenge, even if we acknowledge the challenge of progressives associating with being pro-Israel, there's undeniably progressive achievements in Israel. It's the only country in the Middle East that has universal health care, it has gay rights, it has minority rights, it has a strong legal system. This should be a progressive rallying point. It doesn't sound very conservative.
Right, Mitt Romney loves socialism.
Right. And I think many young progressive Americans see the images of some of Israel's progressive shortcomings. Maybe shortcomings is even too insignificant of a term. But you see the occupation of the West Bank. You see violence in and around Gaza. And these things kind of are an affront to progressive values. So how can progressives take a holistic view of this complicated country and come out with some kind of opinion? If you have these progressive strengths, which are undeniable, but also these things that I think make progressives feel very uncomfortable with Israel. How do you balance that?
I'll go first. No, it is a challenge, but I think it's a matter of like just sort of maintaining a sort of, if you're going to have a running commentary on what Israel is, it's like calling out those unfair criticisms when they come, like that piece in the New York Times that accused Israel of pinkwashing. I don't know if people are familiar with the piece. I mean, the fact of the matter is Israel is very progressive when it comes to gay rights. It's more progressive than the United States. And that's something that I think is really awesome about Israel. It's more progressive, in terms of women in the military by necessity, but the fact of the matter is, and across the board, like you said, healthcare, all these other things. So it's, it's keeping in mind some of the extraordinary things that have been accomplished there. But I think as Americans, we are kind of practiced in that because our country was founded on, the crushed villages and expelled, it's, the Trail of Tears, expelled peoples. I mean, we have a very tough history to take, but, looking honestly and rigorously at that history and understanding how we got to where we are is not to say that we're anti-American. It's just being honest. And it's not to deny some of the extraordinary accomplishments of our own country. And so, again, when I say that we're practiced, and I think just applying that to Israel, recognizing the good, and there's a lot of good to recognize, but still, being clear-eyed about some of the challenges and problems.
I agree.
I'd like to ask more specifically about how a two-state solution fits in with progressive values. First of all, why is two-state solution good policy? Second, why is it something that progressives should rally behind?
Well, why is it good? I think I went over that a little bit. Israel, that everyone in Congress loves so much because of their hummus, and Mitt Romney loves their healthcare now. Israel that people love is a country that is Jewish in character, that is democratic in nature. And right now, if you look at the population between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean, about half those people are Jews and half of them are either Palestinians or Israeli Arabs, most of which call themselves Palestinians. And the ones that live east of the Green Line don't have the same rights as those that live west of the Green Line. So I think if you want this country, to live up to its founding documents, to live up to its democratic ideals, and to be a place that can be a homeland for Jews, then it's the only solution. And I think for the Palestinians, who also want a homeland of their own, who also have claims to the land and a history with the land, I think it's really the only viable solution for them to get a state which they can call home. So I think on the policy side, most people agree. And I'll just take it back. I think the problem is really with politics. I think that you hit it, the nail on the head when you said the parties themselves don't seem to be getting anywhere. And in the U.S., despite the consensus that we keep talking about, people are unwilling to move things forward because they think the politics are too hard. And I think there's a fear on how you can talk about this such a narrow way that makes it difficult and ties the hands of our policymakers to make it happen.
So, with the recognition that there's a consensus, the two-state solution is what needs to happen, it seems that the next step would be a political movement to make it happen. But that would require lots of attention. Why do you think, with all the progressive causes, and when considering this conflict's been around for so long, should any progressive care about this right now? What's the urgency behind it?
That's a good question. I think one of the reasons is that the United States is very deeply implicated in this right now. And as someone who supports a more just U.S. foreign policy, I think taking responsibility for that and recognizing the way that either overtly or by omission, the United States underwrites a continuing and very inhumane occupation. there's also the way that this continuing conflict impacts our relationships both in the region and around the world. I think General Petraeus, when he spoke in front of the Senate 2 years ago, articulated this very well. And ironically, as someone who studies national security in the Middle East, you look at the first Bush term and the whole plan that he and his new conservative advisors had for transforming the Middle East, putting hundreds of thousands of U.S. troops in the region and changing and moving towards democracy. One of the effects of that is that you have all these soldiers, these U.S. troops who were in the region and who really started to understand the way that this conflict, the way that the treatment of the Palestinians, whether that's a true perception or a false perception, impacts those relationships. It's just a political fact in the region. That's not to say that there isn't, anti-Semitic propaganda, anti-Israel propaganda. Of course there is. But I think just understanding the way that this issue is a salient one politically in the region, I think, is one of the interesting and ironic effects of the kind of, U.S. transforming the Middle East policy. So I think understanding that, if the U.S., I want to see the U.S. playing a more positive role in not only regional but world affairs, I think understanding the way that this conflict hinders that and moving it towards a positive solution is essential.
I'd like to open it up now for any questions. We'll take 3 at a time, just in order to make it a little more efficient. So, why don't we start 1, 2, and we'll do 3 right here. Okay? Good. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. This has been so interesting so far. My name's Sam. I studied abroad in Israel, in Jerusalem last fall. And when I was there, something that I noticed when talking with Israeli students at the Hebrew University where I was is this deep pessimism about the political movement on the left in Israel in terms of their capacity to sort of make any changes in terms of cooperating with the United States, with the Palestinian Authority, in terms of having sort of a separate vision apart from Netanyahu that inspired Israelis to not vote for Netanyahu. And there was sort of, they would talk all the time about Ben-Gurion had vision, even they'd name famous figures that were, other figures like Moshe Dayan, anyone, they'd say they had at least had a vision, but no one from Labor, whoever, any of the other parties, doesn't have that sort of direction, and that's why there isn't any movement. And they were totally pessimistic that there was any way to coerce Netanyahu to do anything else. So I was wondering, from your perspective, what is there to be done in terms of the domestic sort of situation of Israel in terms of how these coalitions shake out, and would there, be any movement towards that if there were to be another party in control, if that could even happen?
We're taking 3, right? Right, and then the next one was in the back.
Great. My name is Jesse. I'm a senior at the University of Maryland. Thanks so much for coming. I have a question. There's an article going around now called When the Right is Right About the Left, kind of dealing with the state of the progressive Israel movement in the United States. I was wondering if y'all could comment on the trajectory of the movement and what can be done to kind of better and ensure that we don't just kind of keep talking while Mitt Romney goes and makes not great comments that make all Americans look like fools. But instead, like what the progressive movement could be doing, what J Street and J Street you could be doing to ensure that we actually get to see some progress on leading towards the two-state solution.
Okay, and next was here.
Two-state solution is a nice abstraction. It's very easy to imagine what that means. I'd like to have your thoughts on some not so abstract ideas that are being tossed as to what it would actually mean and look like, specifically in regard to right of return, in regard to Jerusalem, in regard to settlers.
Okay, good luck.
I'm thinking that last one was last, so I'll answer the first 2 and then kick it over to. No, a question on the left in Israel. I mean, having quite a few friends who consider themselves Israeli leftists, this is an ongoing conversation. I think what's happening in Israel, what's happened starting last year, the social protest movement, which has now continued this summer. I think, there's a split among, many of my friends over there. Some of them think that the fact that the occupation was not addressed at all was a sign, once and for all, that Israeli society is simply incapable of ending the occupation on its own. Other friends of mine think that the fact that the occupation is something that is so deeply divisive that when you start talking about it, everyone retreats to their own corners. Whereas by leaving the occupation out of those discussions, it enabled the creation, or at least the beginning of the creation, of new political coalitions that could eventually turn their attention to that problem. Now, I want to believe the latter, but at the very least, I think what is happening right now, and you can see by the way Netanyahu is himself responding to it, he's trying to distract attention from it, as much as he can. He understands it's a challenge. So, I mean, I'm made optimistic by it. But yeah, as far as the leader, I mean, look to our own country. I mean, we didn't get a leader first. We got a movement first. We got a movement around ending the Iraq War and a range of other progressive issues. And fortunately, there was a leader. Different politicians competed for leadership of that movement. Barack Obama eventually would establish himself and won as the leader of that. So I think that's the way it works. I don't think you get a leader first with a movement around it. It's hard to describe one or the other, but I think they tend to work together. So, but there's no denying that the left suffered after the second Intifada. I mean, anyone will tell you that it just discredited the peace camp in the eyes of many Israelis, and that's the situation we continue in. But I think the social protest movement is very, very positive, and that it's articulating, a social justice ethic in Israel right now. And it's appealing to a lot of people for precisely the reasons I think you were getting at, is that it's saying, listen, we have a politics that does not have to be about security all the time. So as one of the effects of the second Intifada was to just securitize everything and say people are like, all right, let the government handle it, but people, there's a movement that is really, really finding its voice right now, and I see that as just generally positive. The gentleman, it was Jay Michelson who wrote that article. Really good article, I thought. I think that's a problem, is, people on the left, I mean, we want to form coalitions with other groups on the left, with other progressive groups, but getting them to be specific about what their end goals are is important. Now, I think there's a fair argument to be made. Some of these groups there are just for justice and equality, and they remain agnostic on one state or two. I understand that argument. In this situation, I think, especially here in the United States, if you want to be politically effective, you can't be agnostic on one state or two. I mean, I understand, philosophically, the arguments for one state. Why shouldn't there just be one state with a one person, one vote? But again, getting back to pragmatism, two states is, I think the least bad of all the options, pragmatically speaking, and favorable for quite a few reasons as well. So yeah, no, I appreciated that piece that he wrote, especially, I mean, as far as I can see, he's coming from very much the place that I am as well. You want me to just touch on the two-state thing?
You're gonna bucket now?
No, you want to pass, you can.
No, just very quickly, and then I'll turn it over to Dan. There are people who've been working on this a lot longer. The challenges that you talk about are big. I mean, that's why they keep being kicked down the road as final status issues. On the right of return, I think there's evidence that the Palestinians would accept some nominal number of Palestinians returning to Israel. Don't know what that number could be, what the Palestinian leadership could actually sell to the Palestinian people. But as I think in the same way that many Israelis want to see the recognition of Israel as a Jewish state, I think what the Palestinians want is a recognition that they didn't just up and leave their homes voluntarily. I mean, that's what they feel they are being told to accept. That's the perception that I get from them, is this idea that the creation of Israel was their expulsion was somehow necessary and just. I think there just needs to be some sort of understanding of what these things actually mean, and they just, as many Israelis, need to feel that their right to a homeland in Israel is accepted. Palestinians need to feel that their own history and their own narrative is affirmed as well. On the settlements, I mean, for me, that's the idea. I think the smallest number that people talk about in terms of a workable, economically viable Palestinian state is we're talking about removing 60 to 80,000 settlers, if not more. That's very hard to imagine. When we saw how many were removed from Gaza, was it 8,000? 8,000, and it was it was not easy. 80,000 people is really difficult. And listen, I'm not obviously I'm not a huge fan of the settlement enterprise, but you're breaking up neighborhoods. You're moving human beings. You're transferring them. You're breaking up. These are schools. It's a tragedy, no matter how you manage it. So yeah, I mean that's just kind of a long-winded way of saying that it's a huge challenge.
I'll just add a couple things on each of those. I think the left is not, there are a lot of fun stories every couple months about how the left is dead in Israel. And then there's a lot of looking to this social protest or the 10 movement and what that means for the revival of the left. I mean, I think it's impressive. I mean, 20% of the population was out on one day protesting. I mean, at the height of our Occupy, et cetera, towns, it was not even, it's just not even close to what we saw in numbers there. So I think there is, at least around the social issues at this point, a desire for a different government. And I think things happen quickly in the Middle East. Coalitions are never very sturdy in Israel. I don't like making predictions about the government, but coalitions will come and go. And I do think there is a lot of folks in the center and the center right of Israel's security apparatus, of Israel's Knesset, that see the writing on the wall and see that their future is dependent on this. And I think there's going to be a movement from there on it, maybe before we see the resurgence of liberalism in Israel, particularly when you look at the younger populations, which are more and more Orthodox Jews and tend to be more conservative. To Jesse's comment, I didn't read the article, but you should send it to me. But I mean, I think that's exactly.
Why don't you read it now?
Read right now, and I'll respond. No, I think because what you keep hearing is, oh, the politics are tough, the politics are tough. There's a consensus. So what that means is you need to build an operation or build a movement that can change the politics. So whether that means you need to play within the political rules as they are in the United States. That's why J Street has a PAC. That's why we raise money for candidates, because that's if there's people raising money for those who have an opposing view, and we think that we're the majority, then we need to show them put our money where our mouth is. That's why you organize in Jewish communities and say, this is actually the majority view of Jews because we care about Israel, we care about Israel's future. That's why you organize on campus. And I think that if you organize a movement around these principles, then you can change the politics, which I think have been broken for some time. And I think you need to do it in a smart way, as Matt said. As far as the difficult issues in solving this, well, what's the alternative? People love to point out the problems with the solution, but what's the alternative? The status quo is not tenable. I mean, particularly now with the so-called Arab Spring and the movements you see across the Middle East, I just can't see a scenario where Israel can maintain control of all this land and never resolve this conflict and maintain its security. I think it's dangerous for Israel to try. I think it delegitimizes it to other nations across the world. It needs to have, people say, oh, is that border defensible? Well, right now there's no recognized border. And that seems the most indefensible border that's out there. So there's going to be some difficult issues. As far as Jerusalem, I think most American Jews say, oh, can't divide Jerusalem. Can't divide Jerusalem. They imagine a big wall going down Ben Yehuda Street and your Coca-Cola t-shirts on one side, and the falafel place on the other, and how am I going to get there because there's going to be a big wall?
Which of those two sides is Israeli?
The Coca-Cola. No, the western side. No, I mean, I think that, there are Arab villages that were annexed in 1967. Most of those are still Arab neighborhoods. Most American Jews, when they visit Israel, never go to those parts of Jerusalem. And those who've been to Jerusalem a lot and live there and maybe, go to some of these areas, it's getting more complicated, which is a whole other issue I'm not going to get into. But these are Arab neighborhoods, and if the Palestinians want those neighborhoods of East Jerusalem to be part of their state and call it their capital, I think that's fine. And I think the truth is that Jerusalem is already a shared city, and so I don't see any problem in sharing it and making sure that everyone has access to their holy sites. There's a lot of creative solutions out there, and I think that it could be agreed to. And I think that's the only thing I'll add on the tough issues. Do we have time for more questions?
Yeah, let's do another round of 3 questions. Okay, so how about these 2 and this right here? We'll go 1, 2, and then 3.
Okay, so thank you very much for speaking. It was really great. So my question is, if a two-state solution happens, do we have reason to believe that Israel will not face more threats from the Arab neighbors? And is that do we have legitimate, I don't know if you can say evidence, but I guess reason to believe that that can really happen? Or are these groups still going to be radical because, at least Hamas's platform is that we want Israel to be destroyed, so.
Yeah, thanks so much for being here. I was hoping you touched on the way the American discourse on Israel has changed. And I was hoping you could talk for just a minute about, in particular, AIPAC, which has really been, I guess, an extraordinary force in American politics, and specifically the ways it's been a positive and a negative in terms of the American discourse about Israel.
Hi, thank you for coming. So I've spent some time in Israel. I have Israeli family, and my question is, regardless of the future of the Israeli left, I think it's pretty hard to deny that most Israelis right now are pretty right-wing, especially on issues regarding foreign policy. And I know, most Israelis who I talk to, not only are they right-wing on those issues, but they're very disdainful of Obama. A lot of them think he's a Muslim, and of the American Democratic Party in general. And when you try to talk to them, about progressive values in general, and especially on Israel, they are pretty resentful, like an American telling them what to do. And especially if you're an American Jew, they say, if you want to make Israeli policy, make Aliyah. And so my question is kind of, how can you reconcile, being pro-Israel with not being what a lot of majority of Israelis think, and then just how do you talk to those people, especially when they're on your campus? Because I think that in my experience, Israelis who are studying in the United States tend to move the pro-Israel groups on campus to the right as well.
All right, I guess I'll go first this time. When we get a two-state solution, will it be paradise on earth, and will all the Arab states embrace Israel and hugs? I don't think so. I don't think that is the right question, though. I think having internationally recognized border, being a democratic Jewish state are positive things. I think it will help a lot with relations among the broader Arab world. I think that, I've heard a lot of people say, first you need to get a divorce, before you can reconcile with your partner. I think the Israelis and Palestinians need to divorce, need to figure out, who gets the house, who gets the this, draw the line, and then I think over time things can heal. It's not going to be the best relationship, but I think being in that region and the economic factors of trade, eventually things can be better. And I just think even if it doesn't guarantee it, it's still essential for Israel to do it. So that's what I'd say on the first one. As far as AIPAC, I think AIPAC has done a lot of amazing work over the past decades. It's been amazing to see that, as someone who, travels to Israel often, who has, family and friends that live there, I think it's fantastic that the U.S. is so supportive of Israel, and the U.S.-Israel relationship is strong, and it is, based on values, but I think AIPAC has helped, build that relationship in a strong, positive way. I think those of us at J Street probably agree with 85 percent of what they advocate for on a daily basis, and the press likes to point out our small disagreements. I'd say what I think what they've done as a political organization is impressive. I would say that in their hopes of constantly being bipartisan and working across the aisle, we've seen a shift in their politics to the right over the past several decades, particularly under Bush. And I think that left a lot of Jewish Americans, who are as I said, the most progressive Democratic voting bloc in the country, going to an APAC conference and hearing people chant 4 more years after Bush spoke, made them feel uncomfortable. And they said this has gone away from where our community is. I think it's one of the reasons we've seen J Street grow so much in representing that alternative. And I think the major difference between the J Street and APAC is really the focus, and ours is really just on the urgency of solving this conflict, and not just on supporting the current government of Israel. As far as Israelis not liking Obama, I recommend Obama goes to Israel. Love to see Obama go to Israel, not just as a candidate, but as a president. Clinton went to Israel. I think it is one of the reasons that I've seen studies of the polling of this, that he was very popular there. I think if Obama went, he's a very good communicator. I think he could win over a lot of Israelis that are skeptical of him now. As far as American Jews, who are we to tell Israelis what to do unless we make Aliyah? Well, Israel wants us to, support them, as individuals, to plant trees in Israel, to visit Israel. I think that, the Jewry worldwide, has a strong connection to Israel, and they want us there when we are praising them and saying good things and defending them against others, and not when we're critical. I think that's an unfair question to ask, and I think as Americans, I think we've touched a lot about how a lot of this is in U.S. American interest, and I think that as Americans we can advocate to our government what's in our interest. Those are my quick answers.
Sure, I'll give some quick answers too. I mean, as to the first question, I think there's clearly a core of people in the Middle East who just will simply refuse to accept Israel, regardless of whether it's a 2-state peace. That's just the unfortunate truth. I mean, the question is, can we create a secure 2-state peace in which those actors have the very minimum of influence? I mean, I think that's the goal. But I think, achieving some sort of just, fair solution for the Palestinians, will go a long way toward that. It will take a long time for Israel, I think, to be fully integrated into the region and have normal relationships. I mean, these kinds of, conflict like this will, people will remember it for a long time. This is a region with a long memory. I don't have to tell anybody that. But again, I mean, this is where the United States can play a very, very positive role, is that a lot of these countries value their relations with the United States, and we have influence over them. So if they want, and this is something we have done and will continue to do, which is to say, well, this is our partner, and we would like you to have better relations with them, and there are rewards in that if you do. As for APAC, I agree, I guess, with most of what Dan said, but I think APAC's goal is to just create a strong U.S.-Israel relationship. And that is their goal regardless of what any of the two governments are doing at the time. And unfortunately, the practical reality of that, especially over the last couple decades, has been essentially to run cover for an occupation. I wish there were a better way to say that, but that's what it is. So, I mean, again, I'm in favor of a strong U.S.-Israel relationship for the reasons I explained earlier. But when the goal is simply to strengthen the relationship and smooth over any differences, regardless of the substance of those differences, I think that can be a problem, and I think has been. Speaking to your family, listen, I'm almost 40 years old, and I haven't figured out how to speak to my own right-wing relatives about all kinds of stuff. So I don't really have any. I just learned not to really talk to them about that. So I wish I had better advice for you. But in terms, as far as challenging you, if you want to make Israeli policy, make Aliyah. Again, as Americans, we are implicated in what Israel's doing for good and bad. I mean, we support Israel. We give Israel $3 billion a year, and if they want that to stop, then they can tell us to shut up about it. But, you know, while that's happening, I think it's all fine for us to have an exchange of views. But again, you know, I recognize, I hear what you're saying. It's difficult sometimes.
Okay, we don't have any more time for questions, so I want to invite Beth to come to the podium to conclude the event.
So I just want to thank Dan Kalik and Matt Duss again for speaking with us today and sharing their insights on what it means to be pro-Israel and progressive. We chose to have this panel because we believe it's vital for pro-Israel advocacy to be rooted in the progressive values of justice, equality, and democracy. These values can be embodied in a two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but as each day ticks by without a resolution, this solution and our progressive values are put at risk. At J Street, we believe we must take action to push for strong U.S. leadership in bringing about a two-state solution. Please join us by filling out our sign-in sheet so we can be in touch with you. Whether you're interested in joining or starting a J Street U chapter, or just want to learn more about J Street, we'd love to be in touch. Thank you so much for coming out to this event. We would love to hear from you. Please stick around, talk to us, and enjoy the food in the back. And there are J Street staff and J Street U national board members around with pins. We would love to hear from you, and have a great night.
Just say what I wanted. Thank you so much.